In 2015, the National Defense Authorization Act required an independent assessment of the rebalance to Asia. And specifically, this study was supposed to look at U.S. strategy and force posture in the Asia-Pacific region through 2025. Part of the Congress's reason for doing so was to try and get more information about how the rebalance is going and to assess progress and to look at what else needs to be done. And so that work was tasked to CSIS, and CSIS took about 9 months to conduct this study. There are challenges across the East Asia region. If you started in the north, certainly the East China Sea has been increasingly tense. The Chinese are putting a great deal of pressure on Japan over the Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands. And the challenge for the United States is that it has a treaty commitment to uphold with the Japanese. And of course, the president has come out and said that the Senkakus are under the administrative control of Japan and therefore fall under the security treaty. And this requires that the United States be capable of helping its ally, Japan, protect its interests in the region around the Senkakus. Now, the Chinese have been building up a large number of Coast Guard ships, as high as 12,000-ton Coast Guard ships, which are incredibly large, larger even than U.S. destroyers. So these are large ships. They're going to change the balance of the Coast Guard capabilities in the region, and it's likely that the United States could get drawn in as this competition heats up. As we go further down, there are challenges around Taiwan, which are long-standing, and those are in many ways likely to worsen around the recent election in Taiwan. The DPP is getting pressure from the Chinese government, from Beijing, and so that's another area to watch. And then finally, in the South China Sea, the long-standing challenges of Chinese construction on features that are disputed with other claimants is just continuing to worsen. Chinese construction has actually gone considerably further than many people expected. And I think what we're seeing across the board is an increased appetite for risk from the Chinese, from what most experts in Washington would have predicted. So the challenge for policymakers here in Washington is, what do they do about these challenges? How firmly do they push back? Where do they push back? And how do they work with allies to do so? This is a topic that we at CSIS are taking a great deal of time and looking into. The status quo, first of all, is contested in the region. So the United States has a pretty clear view of what it thinks the status quo is, but many other countries also have a view that is somewhat different about the claims, whether it's in the South China Sea with China's 9-dash line, or with the Chinese claims about what is legal and illegal in an exclusive economic zone. So the status quo, first, is in dispute. And I think one challenge in the region is that without agreement on the status quo, it's difficult for everyone to agree on what needs to be done to enhance that status quo. The second challenge is that there are some actors that want to change elements of the status quo. This isn't a surprise. Usually when we have rising powers, those rising powers seek to alter the existing structure of the international system in ways that benefit them. And what we're seeing with China today is a growing power that feels that there are elements of the status quo that are not in its best interests, and it's trying to change those. Just, I would add, as the United States did over 100 years ago when it was a rising power as well. So this is in many ways a natural competition between a dominant power and a rising power. The challenge right now in East Asia is that China is rising into a world of U.S. extended deterrence commitments. So the U.S. commitments to Japan, Korea, the Philippines, Thailand, and Australia, which make this system fairly strong, but fairly difficult to change. And so this is a world that we haven't had to deal with before. And one challenge for our allies in the region is that Chinese efforts to change the status quo in many cases call into question U.S. treaty commitments, which are in some cases rather unambiguous, as in the Japanese case, but in others, as in the Philippines case, quite ambiguous. So one question that I think many people in Washington are thinking a great deal about is whether they need to strengthen or specify U.S. treaty commitments in the region and how they apply in certain cases. I think one other issue that I would point out is it seems that many in this recent administration have been unwilling to push back very hard against the Chinese for fear that it would damage the relationship. And there's certainly something to be said for that. The US-China relationship is incredibly important. But in many ways, China's increased risk-taking has been met with, I think, a decreased appetite for risk on the US part. And so one option is to demonstrate that the United States has strong interests in the region and that it will continue to protect those interests, even if there is a cost in the US-China relationship. So exercises with regional allies and partners, cooperation with regional states on freedom of navigation operations, all these types of efforts are going to help strengthen the regional status quo. One finding of our report is that the United States benefits greatly from its allies and partners in the region. This is one area in which the US is unmatched. And one of the benefits for the United States is that it can work closely with those allies and partners to share capabilities, to divide up roles and missions, and to provide access for US forces. So far, US access is generally based in a couple of very, very large facilities. These are often in Korea and Japan and elsewhere. The challenge is that those facilities and those forces that are based there are incredibly vulnerable, and they're increasingly vulnerable to ballistic missiles, to cruise missile attack. And so the challenge is how to diversify US forces so that they're less vulnerable to attack, but also highly effective if there is a warfight. One thing that we've looked at a great deal is how to put more US forces forward, how to change US posture in ways that increase the capability without significantly increasing the risk to those forces. So we make a couple of suggestions for possible posture initiatives. One is looking at adding a second carrier west of the international dateline. I think that would likely go in Japan at Yokosuka. Another option is to look at adding an amphibious ready group. These are marine units, either at Sasebo or at Guam, to add their ability to maneuver from the sea. And these, combined with other efforts such as putting more US submarines forward, whether at Guam or potentially even down the road in Australia, could help increase the ability of the United States to project power into East Asia, even though the growing anti-access area denial threat is maturing and becoming more difficult for the United States to challenge. So overall, the United States is going to have to accept some risk to its forces, especially as its adversaries become more capable. But as long as the United States keeps investing in the region, it can work with its allies and partners to offset many of those risks. Prioritization is certainly a challenge, and this is something that we recognize in our report. The United States is challenged with threats not just in Asia, but in the Middle East and Europe as well. It has had to focus recently on many of those threats, whether it's ISIL or Russia, and much of the news coverage is focused on them. So it's normal that US leaders would want to devote time and attention to those types of challenges. However, much of the world's population is in Asia, much of its economic growth is in Asia, and so we believe that the United States must be committed to the rebalance. The US future, in many ways, is in the Asia Pacific. And that's going to mean that to prevent crises and conflicts from occurring, we're going to have to be in the Asia Pacific as well. Now, the good thing is that the United States already has many of these forces in the region, and shifting additional forces will add a great deal of capability. However, the challenges in the region are growing even more rapidly than US capabilities. So the Chinese anti-access area denial threat has been expanding much more rapidly than the US ability to combat it. So one challenge for the United States is how to deal with a rising China, which is able to focus regionally, while the United States has to focus internationally. And this is, I think, where US posture, where it places its forces, is incredibly important. The United States can put many forces forward, and that decreases the time that they take to get forward in a crisis or a conflict. It also increases their time on station and their ability to provide forward presence to help reassure US allies and partners. So putting forward forces is one way that the United States can help deal with this challenge. Another way is to work closely with allies and partners to build their own capabilities, and in fact to develop some capabilities along with them. So missile defenses, undersea capabilities, these types of efforts are incredibly important, and they're going to be more important as Chinese capabilities grow.